Thank you all for the invitation to be here. It really is my pleasure. I have many friends, colleagues, even a few doctoral students that are part of your research community, and so it's nice to be also asked to be a part of that community. And Peter, the rating of 2.2 while you're interrogating it, and as is appropriate, I might tell you that the quality of educational researchers viewed from the United States and Australia is not in doubt. And the saddest day was a realization for me many years ago that you had finally revised your doctoral program system so that people could get degrees before they're 100 years of age, and they stopped coming to the United States because some of our finest graduate students came out of the Australian system. So the system works despite the numbers, I think. Again, my thanks. Not long ago, I met a teacher who had just retired. She told me about her interesting 30-year career as a classroom teacher, and then said something to me that perked my interest in the assessment of teachers, now being promoted worldwide, with what are called value-added models of teacher effectiveness. These various models of evaluation use some form of student growth and achievement tests as a way of identifying good and bad teachers, and rewarding or punishing those teachers for their students' performance. The teacher I was chatting with informed me that for 10 years she had been a great teacher, for 10 years a really poor teacher, and then for another 10 years a great teacher once again. Naturally, I was intrigued and asked her how that happened. She explained that she taught all 30 years in the same school in East Los Angeles, a section called Boyle Heights, which some of you who know Los Angeles know. During that time period, she only made minor modifications of her teaching style and curriculum, but the judgments made by administrators about her teaching changed over the years from great to awful to great again. And the reason, she said, was simply because the student body kept changing. For the first 10 years of her teaching career, she worked with a largely American-born, upwardly mobile Jewish student body. The next decade, she worked largely with an immigrant Hispanic student body that was both poor and had language difficulties. For her last decade, she served a largely Asian immigrant student body that had language problems, but were not all impoverished, nor were the families all uneducated. Many of those students were both obedient in school and received help with their studies after school. So who this teacher taught made her look great, made her look bad, and made her look great again in the eyes of the state of California. Her story impressed me, since so many of my fellow Americans, as part of our national and I think neurotic and near constant search for magical solutions to our perceived school problems, are great believers in the power of teachers regardless of context, and great believers in the power of numbers devoid of their meaning. These are two dreadful folk beliefs that affect the assessment of teachers in contemporary society. Let me talk about each of these regretful misunderstandings, starting with the misplaced worship of numbers as seen in the Western countries that try to quantify teacher effects on students. To assess something, an object, a piece of land, a politician, a teacher, is to judge its worth. Assessment does not demand that the data used in the judgment either be totally explicable or in quantified form. For example, assessment by critics and connoisseurs has long been sought after and found enlightening, and yet the criteria used by critics and connoisseurs are not always explicable and usually devoid of numbers. When knowledgeable professionals judge the worth of a piece of art, the performance of a symphony, the preparation of a gourmet dish, the taste of wine, or the performance of an Olympic event, we don't necessarily expect either clearly articulated criteria or numerical values for their assessments. Of course, tests, surveys, scoring rubrics, and the numbers that they yield can be used to score movies, wines, Olympic events, and so forth. And if used sensibly, such quantification helps us in our desire to assess the worth of something, even teachers. But assessments that are both insightful and useful do not depend on quantification. Of late, particularly in the USA, the assessment of teachers by those who know their work best and can render professional judgments as to its quality, worth, and merit has now been found to be unacceptable practice in the scientific age we live in, dominated also by business and economic interests. There has developed in this age a penchant for numerical expressions for all aspects of human existence, despite Einstein's warning that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. your 2.2 rating, which you interrogated, seems to qualify for one of those numbers that's a little devoid of meaning. In the new age of global educational policy, aptly named GERM, G-E-R-M, standing for Global Education Reform Movement, this penchant for numerical displays results in a desire to assess teachers using quantitative estimates of student growth on achievement tests, and to abandon professional judgment, inspectorates, the use of portfolios that include evidence of student work, judgments about the quality of the plays put on or the debates engaged in, and so forth. Dozens of other valued outcomes for students, such as increased motivation to succeed, better standards for judging one's own work, better question-asking ability, increased empathy for those with mental, physical, or economic difficulties, could be used to judge teachers' merit or worth, but they are not. They are ignored. Only achievement test score gains count as a measure of teacher competence. Your Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, is on board with the other GERM advocates in wanting achievement test scores to be a part of teacher evaluation. As I understand it, she will use those scores to provide bonuses to, quote, high performers, unquote, beginning in 2014. While the weight given to the test scores in the evaluations is presently low, I predict that the importance of the test scores in determining a, quote, high performer will go up in the next few years, crowding out the other ways she hopes to measure effectiveness. This desire for a numerical value just seems overwhelming in modern times. I also predict that there will be increased gaming of the evaluation system by teachers and administrators, as now occurs in the USA, and I'll mention that a little later. Let me now analyze in more depth the other naive and troublesome belief, namely that a teacher that is good or bad will be that way regardless of context. Everyone who has taught knows that simply is not true. Everyone who has taught has bombed once in a while with one particular class and succeeded admirably with another. But the root assumption of all the models of value added by teachers, as determined from achievement test scores, is that good and bad teachers are consistently good and bad teachers. You can find them and reward those at the top and dump the ones at the bottom because both groups identified are consistently good or bad. This assumption is simply wrong. We have unequivocal proof that the estimates of teacher effectiveness derived from every known value-added model of assessment are unstable from class to class when teachers teach the same subjects to two different classes in the same year, and they're unstable estimates when they are teachers year to year. When the scores that indicate teacher effectiveness are so wobbly, so unstable, so subject to chance, the validity of that score as an indicator of teacher effectiveness is seriously compromised. While teacher effects on the lives of individual children may be both direct and powerful, teacher effects on classroom achievement may be less direct and much weaker. If that is so, we are in danger of making an attribution error because we will be confusing the powerful and direct effects teachers can have on an individual student with teacher effects on classroom achievement that are moderated by a myriad of variables. Let me give you a simple example of this contribution of a classroom peer or composition effect that affects the achievement of the class. Suppose that in a class you teach one year, you had 26 students, 16 females and 12 males. But in a class you teach later in the day or in a class you draw the next year, you had 16 males and 12 females. Would you expect your students' achievement growth to be the same in the two classes? Every teacher I asked in the USA said that the achievement scores, the growth will be higher in the classes with more females. They told me girls are better behaved, they do their homework more frequently, their handwriting is actually readable, many of them admire their teacher because they want to be teachers themselves, and they are more likely to study for their examinations instead of playing with their Xboxes or going online to play World of Warcraft. My point is that if we judge teacher effectiveness by using student test scores to determine the value added by a teacher, we are in danger of making attribution errors about the causes of effectiveness. Forget, if you can, the very real and powerful effects teachers have on individual students. Every one of us have experienced that. This is something we've all experienced for ourselves or with our children or siblings. Think instead about the teacher effects on classroom mean achievement, different from the person. I am arguing that what we ordinarily call teacher effects appears to depend on the interactions among many variables: peer or compositional effects of classrooms and schools, curriculum effects, school leadership effects, school climate effects, technology integration and usage effects, district leadership effects, per pupil expenditures, professional development, and so forth. Let me try to help you visualize this. Now the real question, will this work? The politicians, business leaders, and public currently think of the influence of a teacher on a student like this. But everyone who is taught knows that the relationship is much more likely to be reciprocal, more like this. In fact, all those politicians, business leaders, and anyone among the general public who have either been parents or had a pet knows full well that the simple model of influence they hold is ridiculous. Relations with every child they have and all pets they ever had depends on characteristics of the child or the pet. Influence always goes both ways. Why people cling to beliefs they know to be untrue or logically inconsistent is a common psychological problem that is hard to understand. And if we think about classrooms, not a single student, then the relationship of a teacher to the students is more complex and looks like this. But students also have relationships with each other. They form small clusters: the nerds, the jocks, the cheerleaders, the defiant ones, the gifted, special education kids. And thus these 25 or more reciprocal individual relationships that a teacher maintains, each of which affects achievement, are also supplemented by dozens more reciprocal relationships with the students as members of their groups. And I use groups as the plural because a student has membership in multiple groups. The number and power of, say, the compliers and the resistors in a classroom, or the anxious and the non-anxious in a class, can dramatically affect the outcomes of schooling in a particular year. Yet such characteristics of classrooms are typically unmeasured, which is a major problem for value-added approaches to assess teachers, because it is a given in all value-added approaches that sources of influence on student achievement scores are knowable and/or controllable. But this problem is merely the tip of the exogenous variable iceberg. The real issues are outside of classroom variables, affecting achievement inside the classroom. A definition of exogeny. In an economic model, an exogenous change is one that comes from outside the model and is unexplained by the model. I don't know how many economists are here, but they are among the most arrogant people I've ever met. You know, they actually believe their equations, you know. Okay. So here's the real state of affair. Each arrow equals one or more variables that are outside the equations and thus unexplained by any value-added model of teacher effectiveness. The number of such unaccounted for variables is inestimable. It seems clear that many of the outside the school and outside the classroom variables, as well as the more proximal inside the classroom variables, are hidden from us, lurking as unexamined exogenous variables, or if measured, measured quite imperfectly, and thus poorly controlled. And regardless of whether these variables are measured well or poorly, these variables are rarely analyzed as part of a second or third or higher order interaction term. But that doesn't mean that such interactions are not occurring. If you don't look for interactions or cannot look for them because of the limitations of the statistical methods used, that does not mean that second and third order interactions are not occurring. All of us here understand that one reason for the great rise in qualitative educational research was the recognition that quantitative research cannot find reliable measures for all that occurs in schools that's worthy of study, nor can quantitative research ever capture all the interactions that occur. American policymakers appear blind to the teacher-by-student or teacher-by-peer group two-way interactions, and they cannot even conceive of the three-way interactions between teachers, characteristics of classroom peers, and characteristics of neighborhoods from which the students come. American politicians have no ability to understand, or they want to ignore those complexities in their policy work. In part, I think this is because we live with the myth of the individual as the hero in so many of the stories that we either read about or experience in theaters, particularly when we're growing up. Clint Eastwood as Dirty Harry or as a lone moral cowboy always cleans up the city or guns down the bad guys all by himself. Gary Cooper in High Noon had to go it alone. Sylvester Stallone as Rocky or in war films overcomes the bad guys mostly by himself. America loves individuals as heroes. So only one good teacher is needed to fix everything and run the bad students or the bad administrator out of town. Blackboard Jungle, Lean on Me, Dangerous Minds are all films with individual heroes. The most dramatic example, I think, is Jaime Escalante as portrayed in Stand and Deliver. He was a standalone hero, rightfully admired by us all. But what people don't know is that Jaime Escalante moved to Sacramento after his heroic work in East Los Angeles teaching calculus to poor Hispanic kids. And he was not successful in developing his program there. So was it Escalante, the lone man taking on the world, the great teacher with great skills? Or was it the interaction of Escalante with some social and contextual factors that mattered? Escalante's success and his failure to replicate that success makes my point. It's not often just the teacher, but the teacher in interaction with the students, the school climate, the neighborhood, and the social context of the school that determines a lot of what we call teacher effectiveness. Despite the continuing American belief in the power of teachers to transform lives, and the many anecdotes that confirm this belief, and despite the occasional demonstration that a school or a teacher actually has these kind of main effects, overall, the power of the individual teacher, independent of the group with which that teacher works, may be much less than most people think. Let me turn now to the evidence of teacher instability and effects on student achievement and its causes. But I want to preface those findings with a discussion of the stability or instability of high and low achievements of any kind. I want to remind you that luck or randomness, and thus regression to the mean, all plays a big role in any case of extraordinary success and failure, which is precisely what value-added models seek to find. In value-added approaches, we search for extremes, and those are positions in a distribution that are not easy to maintain unless your measures have remarkably high reliabilities. But since value-added models are all growth scores, we can always expect reliability problems because they are built into growth scores. Thus, anytime you want to find the top or bottom performers, you are likely to be selecting a pool of people who came your way, at least in part, maybe primarily, by chance. This common finding shows up when we realize that not many companies or many sports figures are deemed successful year in and year out. If any of you remember the best-selling book called In Search of Excellence, I used it as a Bible to talk about school administration, you recall that a number of companies were singled out for their remarkable value-added performance. But the profitability of all these excellent companies dropped sharply in the next few years. Their excellence was not enduring. The next big book in business was Built to Last. The differences in profitability between the 18 firms ranked high and the poorer companies in the same field to which they were compared shrank dramatically in the years after the book was released. These companies did not last as well as was first thought. As Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman reminds us, stories of high flyers and their deficient peers are loved by readers, all of whom are trying to extract lessons to be learned from these cases of achievement and its opposite. But the real lesson to be learned is that stability is more often than not a myth, and that luck and regression are always at work. Luck and regression are far more prevalent than is acknowledged, certainly by policymakers. Let's look at some sports now for a moment as preface also. See, this is a point about luck, okay? The conditions for bowling are clear. The playing surface is a lane 60 feet long, 42 inches wide. The pin is made of this, blah, blah, blah. Bowler's performance is scored with 100% reliability. Bowling ranking. Here's 1 to 10 in 2008-9. There's their rating in 2009-10. There's their rating in 2010 and 11. Here's the next batch, and again, their ratings in 3 years. Well, let me go back. What's important to notice is that 12 of the 20 top bowlers in 2008-9 were not even ranked in 2 years later. Okay, you pick for an extreme that disappears on you. Okay, let's go to golf. Here's the first 50, second 50, third 50, fourth 50, the top 200 world golf rankings in 2007, 2008, 2010. You can see the non-ranked in 2010 constitute a large number. In fact, 2007-8, out of the best 200 golfers, 48 were not on the top list next year. In 2007 to 10, out of the best 200 golfers, 88 were not on the top list in 3 years. Let's now switch to studies of stability of teacher effects, because I think we find the same phenomena. Newton, Darling, Hammond, Ed Hartel, and Thomas found that even though a number of different value-added models of teacher effectiveness were looked at, and they all controlled for student characteristics, it was still found that English teachers' rankings on effectiveness were negatively correlated with the proportions in their classes that were English language learners, free lunch recipients, or Hispanic. And the measures of teacher effectiveness were positively correlated with the proportions of students who were Asian or whose students had highly educated parents. Remember, these significant correlations were found after student demographics were accounted for by traditional statistical methods. The statistical controls couldn't control enough. The researchers also found that English teachers were ranked higher in effectiveness when they had more girls in their class, and math teachers were ranked higher in effectiveness when they had a higher proportion of students who had better math preparation in previous years. Again, this was this occurred, these significant correlations occurred after the statistical controls were applied. Okay? You just can't take it all out. Okay? The authors, among whom is one of the leading statisticians in the world, say that the presence of significant correlations between teacher effectiveness rankings and the demographic compositions of classrooms signals a powerful composition or contextual effect when we measure teacher effectiveness. Individual student achievement is affected not only by their own individual background characteristics, a well-established finding, but also by the characteristics of other students in their class. For value-added systems, we see that a failure to account for all the possible classroom compositional effects is an error. And even if you could specify them all, adequately controlling for them seems difficult to do. And even if you did that, you probably wouldn't have any power to detect the interactions of teacher characteristics and student characteristics. All of these problems, blithely ignored by value-added advocates, leads to misunderstandings about the nature and magnitude of the teacher effect on student learning. Apparently, teaching a class in which most students come from highly educated families yields higher value-added scores because each individual student's learning is boosted by the presence of other well-supported and highly motivated students. We confuse that with a pure teacher effect. Similarly, a teacher assigned a class in which most students come from poorly educated families, or teaching a class with a larger percentage of boys, or teaching one with more English language learners, or one in which last year's teacher was weak, is likely to produce lower value-added scores because each individual student's learning is affected by the presence of other students with difficulties adjusting to school. Here are the data that these authors found on misclassifications when looking at measures of effectiveness from class to class in the same year or class to class over 2 years. These are 3 teachers, T1, 2, and 3. They each in the same year taught a high-track class in blue and an untracked class, not a low track, an untracked class in the purple. So teacher 1 was in the 7th decile, pretty good, when they taught the high track, but only in the 3rd decile when they taught the untracked. Teacher 2 made it to the 8th decile in the high track, but was down at the 1st decile in the untracked. Teacher 2, is that a good teacher or a bad teacher? You see, there isn't a good answer to that. Okay? Teacher 3 made it to the 9th decile. Let's reward that one under Gillard's scheme. Let's give that a $5,000 bonus. Oops, there's the untracked. They're not a very good teacher. Let's take the money back. You see, that's the conundrum we face in the value-added stuff. The misclassifications, if you look across the rows, those are 2 courses taught the same year, misclassifications by 1 or more decile, 2 or more deciles, 3 or more deciles. Changes in the teachers' rankings, 1 decile, there's almost 100% chance you're going to shift. So if you're only rewarding the top decile, okay, the next year, there's almost a 100% chance the teacher's not there. Okay? You can see, you can read it for yourself. You can see that the misclassifications are quite dramatic. The implications for these schemes in the US and here are clear. Another study makes this point as well. In New York City, they believe they have created a sophisticated system for determining the value added by a teacher. Previous year's students' achievement scores are put into an equation with the following variables used to moderate those scores. A poverty index, the number of limited English-speaking immigrants, number of students with disabilities, number of students with student suspensions, number of students who repeated a grade, the number that attended summer school, class size, newcomers to the school, and demographic information such as race and gender. They put that all into a monster equation. The resultant value added by a teacher is scaled from 0 to 100, with 0 being bad and 100 being great. Here's the scatter plot for value-added scores from the 2008-9 and the 2009-10 testing of 13,000 New York school teachers. I mean, we can make logical arguments about value added, but this speaks pretty well to what's going on. The stability of these scores from year to year is still bad, with the average teacher shifting 25 percentile ranks. They cannot figure out why such variability exists because they refuse to believe that there are more exogenous variables than they can account for, and that these many exogenous variables are all interacting in unknown ways. There are two more things to note here. One is that the correlation still reaches 0.35. Those of you who know the research on teaching area know that Brophy found just about that 40 years ago. No covariates, nothing, just year-to-year stability effects, and he found the same thing. So we have a lengthy history of saying teachers from year to year are variable, and we now have it with more sophisticated models. So even though there's not a great deal of stability in teachers' value-added rank one year to the next, if that correlation were interpreted as a validity coefficient, it is smack in the middle of the range of most validity coefficients now in regular use in employment, military, and other educational work. Thus, these data are still good enough to predict a few good and a few bad teachers 2 years in a row. The big question is, do they predict it 3 years and 4 years in a row? Remember, it's just like the SAT in the US. Correlation for the SAT and first-year grades is about 0.4 as the validity coefficient. Well, that's not very high, but it predicts who's going to succeed the first year and who won't. So you let some into college and you keep some out. But the 4-year predictions are very, very weak. Okay, so there's something in here that may be worth thinking about. The second issue here is that if the data was rerun, as the author did, just for the 707 teachers that were first-year teachers, the results are pure chance that one would get a higher value-added score the second year than the first. Now, that defies everything we know about the growth in teacher competency from year 1 to year 2, thus making another argument for the lack of validity in these measures. But the best case I know of for inane, immoral, and unlawful use of value-added systems is from Houston, Texas. I love Texas. As seen in data presented by my colleague, Audrey Amron-Beardsley, and our student, Clarin Collins. Let me describe for you the value-added scores of a Houston teacher, Miss J, I'll call her, with 10 years' experience in the Houston Independent School District. In this analysis, scores between -1 and +1 indicate the teacher's value-added scores was within plus or minus 1 standard error of the scores obtained by teachers like them. So there's a central tendency here, and we can ignore a lot of that. Over the 4 years of data that I'm going to show you, the pattern looked like this for Miss J's mathematics. She scored -2.03, a very negative score, compared to teachers with classes like her. That's a bad teacher. But in 2007-8, she got a +6.8, sort of modest, at least positive. She taught grade 3 in 2008-9, modest, just over the 0 mark. But in 2009-10, she hit a whopping 3.46, a big value-added score. Okay, this is a great teacher in 2010, though she wasn't very good in 2006. Here's her scores in reading over the 4 years, negative, over a standard error, about a standard error in 2007-8, plus 2.03, plus 1.81. She went again from a bad teacher to a good teacher when she moved from grade 5 to grade 4 to grade 3. She must have found her mark. Here's her language arts scores, plus 112, minus 0.49, minus 0.177. She's a disaster in language arts. But notice a validity problem again. Criterion validity demands that tests that are supposed to be in the same domain are correlated. If you look at her language arts and her reading scores in 2008, 9, and 9, 10, they're not correlated, suggesting again a criterion validity problem. Okay, so let's move on. We have more data for her. So science and social studies. She was positive in science 1 year, up a lot, down a lot the next year, when she moved from grade 5 to grade 4. In social studies, she was up, and then she was down. Okay. There's a lesson to be learned from this wobbly pattern, seen quite clearly in the measures of teacher effectiveness with standardized tests. When effectiveness is measured using EVAS, the evaluation system, it can yield unreliable estimates about a teacher's skills. Despite assurances by the SaaS company that markets the EVAS system that the measures of teacher effectiveness are stable, we see that Miss J's scores were above average 8 times, significantly so 5 of those times. Her scores were below average 8 times, significantly so 5 times. As Amron, Beardsley, and Collins note, if you had flipped a coin and decided heads was a good teacher and tails was a bad one, you would have been right as often as this system revealed Miss J to be. Now, the EVAS system, produced by Bill Sanders and then produced by SAS, is selling it all over the world. It's a proprietary system. Nobody besides Sanders has ever looked inside it. They won't release it. Okay? Now, I don't know how you feel about scientific investigations, but if your methods aren't open to scrutiny, it's not science, it's anecdote. Okay? And I think SAS is doing a disservice to our field because people can't examine the algorithms used. Clearly, they reveal some instability. You should also know that Ms. J's supervisor rated her extremely high in 4 of the 5 years for which there were data, and she received bonuses totaling $7,800 for her excellence in 3 of the 5 years. Ms. J was also given a Teacher of the Month award in 2010 and a Teacher of the Year award in 2008, both awarded by her colleagues. Oh yes, you should also know that Ms. J was fired for incompetence in her 5th year. Ms. K is another example of the stupidity of Houston policymakers who appear to have designed an invalid high-stakes evaluated system and choose to stay with it. The data on Ms. K covers 4 years. She was a new teacher, and her evaluated scores for reading and mathematics were positive in half those years and negative in half those years, showing no particular pattern. Yet in each of those years, she received bonuses that totaled about $6,500. Clearly, her supervisors were satisfied with her performance. And clearly, if they judged her performance satisfactory in years when her value-added scores were poor, then there is a criterion validity problem again. The value-added assessment of competence and the supervisor's assessment of competence were not measuring the same things, though they were intended to do that. There's new data from Houston that Clarence Collins just told me about last week, that supervisors rating teachers high then look at the value-added scores, and if the scores are low, they downgrade their rating. So they're trying to match the numbers because the numbers must be right. Ms. K's reading and language arts scores went down in 2009-10. Her social studies scores were also considered quite low. Nevertheless, her supervisors apparently had reason to think she was quite competent since they awarded her a $1,200 bonus. But shortly after that, in light of her value-added score, she also was fired for incompetence. Not counted in the interpretation of her scores in year 4 of her career was the fact that an inordinate number of English language learners were transitioned into her classroom. These were children for which she was not trained to teach. As I noted earlier, because of the strange trust we place in numbers, the context within which the numbers were developed was considered irrelevant. Houston shows that characteristics of the students we teach interact with our teaching skills and moderate our effectiveness as teachers. From past research on observing teachers, we learned that there is considerable instability in teacher behavior from observation to observation. Generalizability and Theory has informed us that reliable observation of many of the teaching behaviors we deem important requires many different highly trained observers and many different occasions on which to observe because teacher behavior is so variable occasion to occasion. Now, recent research informs us that measures of teacher effectiveness are also unreliable, unstable from class to class or year to year. So obviously, the correlations of teacher behavior with teacher effectiveness measures is always low. For those of us who like teacher education and want to do well by our students in training, you can see what a problem this is. If the teacher behaviors are unstable from moment to moment, and the teacher effectiveness are unstable, what the hell do you correlate so that you can figure out what to teach teachers to do? It becomes a real problem, and it's why educational research has such a low reputation, I think, in the field. But instead of downgrading educational research, we ought to be upgrading the complexity of the work that professionals do. That's the reason for the instability, I think. Okay? It's a positive, not a negative, but it's viewed as a negative. Okay. This all suggests to me this behavioral instability for particularly low inference variables and the instability of teacher effects. Really three things. First, that the observation instruments and the tests we use to judge teachers are remarkably unreliable. That probably is not true. A second reason for the observed instability in teacher behavior and effects is that practicing teachers are themselves unstable in their professional behavior. That too is not likely, but I must admit, I've met a teacher or two that struck me as unstable. The third hypothesis, the one that fits, I think, is that the behavior and the effects of teachers are highly conditioned by classroom life and classroom, school, and community characteristics. The sources of instability are in the behavior of students and the characteristics of the classroom, schools, and community, as well as the nature of the curriculum being worked on, and even the weather. If this is true, we may be overestimating the main effects that teachers have on students and underestimating the interaction effects and especially the reciprocal nature of the influence patterns. Now, I threw in that issue about the weather making teacher behavior unstable because of an event that happened. I used to do a lot of classroom observations, and I would use observation instruments. And I had a teacher that was near my home. On the way to work, I would stop off, take out my instruments, and code classroom interaction to see if I could use the instruments in order to tell field workers, how to use them and that sort of thing. And this one particular day, I get in there right after the morning sessions start, and I'm working with my instrument. And along about 11:15 in the morning, she sends the kids out of the room for their break. And she comes over to me and she says, "Hi, David, did you get what you were looking for?" I said, "No, not really today." And she said, "What were you looking for?" And I said, "I was looking for higher level questions, higher order questions, creative questions. And you're pretty good at that most times, but I didn't score one today, not one." She said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Do you have any idea why?" She thought for a moment. She said, "Oh, it's raining," and turned around and walked away. You understand. So I said, "Wait, Barbara, help me." And it's both a good example of tacit knowledge and why teacher behaviors may be unstable. She said, "Well, it's raining." She said, "When it's raining, I can't send the kids out to play. If I can't send them out to play, they have too much energy. They go to the central room inside the cafeteria room. They don't run around. They have too much energy. When they come into classroom, they're fidgety. If they're fidgety, I can't ask a higher order question. I have to ask a lower order question and keep the pace and absolute control of everything that happens in the classroom." Well, I mean, how am I supposed to know that, So here's a teacher who on one day asked magnificent, higher order questions, and I was thrilled by what I witnessed. And on another day, was doing something different. This is complexity we deal with, and it affects everything we learn in our classrooms. Let's see. My point is that if the world is really as complex as hypothesized from an interactionist framework, policymaking becomes very messy work. U.S. President Harry Truman once asked his staff to find him a one-armed economist because he was tired of hearing things like, on the one hand this, and on the other hand that. He wanted a simple main effect on which to base his policies. But to their credit, the academics he dealt with wouldn't always give that to him. Simple main effects make life easy for policymakers like Obama and Gillard. But the real world may call for much more interactionist thinking, that is, for complexifying rather than simplifying the way we perceive the world. The teacher effect from class to class and year to year appears to be moderated by many different exogenous variables, often in interaction, and thus value-added models will always have validity problems, always. This is a serious and I think a fatal flaw in value-added approaches, and in my estimation, impossible to fix. Simple main effect thinking coupled with a desire for the lone hero or heroine ignores the complexity of classroom life while also shutting down the research for more and probably more expensive measures that might assess teacher quality better. In the remaining time I have, I want to briefly document the causes for the instability, these compositional effects, and give you just a taste of them. I could go into every study in detail, but I'm going to skim a number of them and just give you a flavor of the first few. How ubiquitous these exogenous peer or compositional effects on teachers and teaching are, conditioning or interacting with measures of teacher effectiveness. I go first to Chile, and somebody I know, Pat McGowan. He states unequivocally that the classroom mean of mother's education is the most important peer determinant of achievement in the classroom. He says a 1 standard deviation increase in mother's mean educational level leads to over a 1/4 standard deviation rise in student performance in Spanish language arts. If inadequately controlled for or ignored, the composition of the class moderates the size of the teacher effect. The mean of a father's education also had significant positive effects on achievement, but these were smaller in magnitude. In addition, an increasing percentage of indigenous students in a classroom tended to lower achievement, all else being equal. But again, the magnitude of the effect was small. Now, though small, note how this might work if we assume McEwen's result might generalize to Australia and your Aboriginal population, which I understand do not typically do well in the public schools. So then, if you had 10 indigenous students in your classroom, this is from Chile, and that number went up to just 13, an increase of 30%, you can expect a loss in student achievement of nearly 10% of a standard deviation. That works out to be about 1 month's worth of achievement in the ordinary test metrics that we use in the USA to determine student achievement and teacher effectiveness. It's a 1-month loss depending on compositional effects. Here's a study by Lave, Silva, and Weinhardt, this time from England. Their results show that a large fraction of low-achieving peers at school, as identified by students in the bottom 5% of the national ability distribution, negatively and significantly affect the cognitive performance of all the other students in the school. They found that it is the very bottom 5% of the students that negatively affect achievement. They also found that girls, particularly those in the lower half of the overall ability distribution, benefited significantly from interactions with very bright peers. Boys, however, I should have guessed, showed the opposite effect. When there was a higher proportion of bright peers, the scores of the average boy and the below average boy dropped. Interactions abounded in the data. These authors say classroom composition affects what and how much boys and girls learn independent of teacher effects, unquote. So, okay, you get the feel for that. I can run through some of these. Ammermüller and Pischke used the Pearls reading data for 6 different European countries. Social class composition affects measures of teacher effectiveness after statistically controlling for it. Schneeweiss and Winter-Ebermeyer in Denmark, social cultural levels of classes affects effectiveness. They used a measure of home talk about political or social issues, and that home talk made a difference even after you controlled for most of the social variables. They report that if you move the average student to a new peer group 1 standard deviation higher on the index they used, you could expect the student's reading achievement to rise by 5 points on the PISA scale, and their math and reading scores to rise about 7 points. Now, these data also confirm something that happens in the US. We have something called the tiger moms in the US. These are often Asian mothers who are very different than the typical American mother in pushing their kids for higher achievement. But it's a pursuit of the neighborhood that has the great teachers. So there's, America's very highly segregated by housing, and the people who are upwardly mobile are trying to get into the districts that have the great teachers. It turns out the data I'm presenting to you, is that it isn't great teachers, it's great peers, okay? So what they're looking for are great peers, and that's really what's going to affect their kids' scores. And they're absolutely right. The tiger moms are going after great peers. They think they're going after great teachers. Okay. Schindler Angvid in Denmark found that low ability students are helped by the presence of high ability students. High ability students are not hurt by the presence of low ability students. That's an interaction term, okay? It's a disordinal ordinal interaction. Levin found it in the Netherlands. Jeannie Oakes found it in the US. In general, the compositional effects of classrooms and schools are even more powerful in the life of the least academically talented, lower social class students. Scholastically and socially effective classmates determine much of what we call the teacher effect or even the housing effect. Let's go to the USA. The percent female, percent black, percent Asian, and other compositional configurations affect everyone's scores. She tells us, using the Texas Assessment of Knowledge and Skills in grades 3 to 6, Hauksbee found that a 1-point change in reading scores in the mean peer group score of a class, a tiny 1-point score increase on the Texas test, raises any particular student's own score by 0.25 of a point, 0.25 points, okay? And if you're rewarding people, that matters, okay? They get rewards just by slight differences in peer group. Any student then that gets placed in a class that scores 10 points higher on the Texas test than did the last class they were in is estimated to have their own personal score go up 2.5 points. That could be the difference between getting into a better high school or getting into college in your grade point average, which is why those tiger moms in the USA are correct. Try to get their kids into those schools where their peer group is quite good. The possibility of receiving a bonus or being dismissed should not hinge on such things as the composition of your classroom, but it does in Houston. Teachers already there have figured this out. In Houston, teachers seek students for their classes who are mid-level in achievement or well-behaved middle-class, low-achieving kids, because they are, in the words of one of the teachers interviewed, quote, the money kids, unquote. Okay, these are the kids I make money on. I don't want these other kids. They are the ones that are likely to gain the most and get you a bonus. To be avoided like the plague, say those teachers, are English language learners and gifted students because they don't show growth on the tests. And thus you could get fired or receive no bonus if you teach those kinds of students. So they're even avoiding the gifted because with our scaling systems, you're topping out, you're not getting the growth. They want the low average kids, by God, and they can get $5,000 for them, okay? Bounty hunting in Houston. It's an old Texas tradition. Already, principals are helping teachers they like and hurting teachers they do not like by manipulating class rosters at the start of the school year. Favorite teachers of the principal get easier to teach students, and disliked teachers get the children who are expected to show the least growth on the test, allowing the principal to have those teachers removed. In Houston, we have reliable evidence of this kind of collusion to game the value-added system in order to receive bonuses and to avoid being fired, and you can expect the same thing here. Perry, whose work I admire here in Australia, found that school social and cultural compositional factors outweigh the students' own social and cultural factors by a factor of 2. That's a powerful effect if you know her work using the PISA data. Rumberger and Pallardy in the USA found similar school social and cultural compositional factors were equal to students' own social and cultural factors. The peer groups matter a lot. From a plethora of research, we learned that individual student characteristics and unique family characteristics contribute to achievement. Everyone already knew that. We also know that teachers' characteristics contribute to achievement. Everyone already knows that. But research now informs us that classroom and school compositional effects may be among the most powerful of the factors leading to mean classroom achievement and classroom growth, and that the interactions of various characteristics of student, teachers, and families and schools seems often to go unanalyzed. If the stakes are high, an inability to account for interactions among a host of exogenous variables may be the fatal flaw in value-added models of assessment. Okay, let me reach my conclusion. I found a study of compositional effects in preschool that actually makes my argument best. Henry and Rickman, 2007, studied preschools, and they say the ability level of the peers in a child's classroom, preschool classroom, has direct effects on the child's cognitive skills, pre-reading skills, and expressive language skills after controlling for preschool resources, family characteristics, and the child's skills at the beginning of preschool. That's a powerful statement. Poor people in the USA don't get high-quality preschool. The poor people are watched by neighbors. They're watched by aunties and uncles. The quality of the peers may be 2 or 3 cousins, as opposed to a high-quality preschool. And these people are telling us in a really sound research study that if you're with high-quality peers, your cognitive abilities are modified quite greatly. The researchers concluded that studies that did not take into account peer effects on achievement probably overestimate the effects of school-level variables such as class size, discipline policy, curriculum and leadership, and even teacher quality. The preschool study provides one of the few clear statements about the issue. Measures of teacher effects are probably inflated when we look at the outcomes of schooling without really having good measures of peer or compositional effects, or without being able to control for them, or without understanding the myriad exogenous variables that are interacting with life in classrooms. What we see when we obtain a teacher effect is an average effect in any one year confounded with other effects occurring in that classroom and school that year, resulting in quite variable estimates of teacher effectiveness in different classrooms across years, across different sections of classes in the same year, and across different subject matters taught by the same teacher. The miracle, it seems to me, is that in the face of all the complexity that characterizes classroom teaching, so many of our teachers do such an adequate job of teaching year in and year out, and so few are actually found to be consistently bad teachers. In my opinion, the research associated with value added is quite unsupportive of value added models, but it is quite positive about the professionals who do teaching. When the class is the unit of analysis, what we find is a great deal of competent instruction, and it produces adequate effects on students in the midst of amazing complexity. We see much less of the extremely great and extremely bad teachers of political and media myth. Thank you for listening.